Let's see how we can create this simple drop shadow effect, actually using two drop shadows on the same layer combined with a gradient overlay and an inner shadow. So starting out here with our beginning file, I'll double click to the right of the layer name and we'll start by adding the first of our drop shadows. So the first point I want to make here is that we can have more than one drop shadow. And if we have more than one, assuming that we want them to have different angles, we need to not be using global light. So I need to turn off use global light. The second point I want to make is that often with a drop shadow, it's good to sample the color from your background color. So rather than use the default color of black, I'm going to sample the color from my background. Now the values that I'll be using, I'll be just replicating the values that you saw in the finished version, but the way I got to them was by determining the angle of the shadow, not so much numerically over here by dialing this around or just by putting in a numeric value, but rather by moving onto the image and dragging the shadow where I want it to be. The values that I ended up with are an angle of 120, a distance of 73, a spread of 20, and a size of 52. Now in addition, I want to increase the opacity to 88, and for this first drop shadow I want to add some texture by increasing the noise. And I'm going to increase the noise to 25%, and if I press Command plus just to zoom in on that shadow, you can see that that's added some texture to the shadow. I'm now going to add a second shadow by clicking on the plus symbol. This starts out with all of the same values, many of which are just the way we want them to be, but there are a few things about this one that we want to change. I'm going to increase the opacity on this one to 100%. I'm going to change its angle to 127%, reduce its distance so it's not so far offset from the text to 29 pixels, increase the spread to 56%, which is going to make the shadow more cohesive, if you like, and then reduce the size to 25 pixels. Don't want any noise on this one, so I'm going to move that slider down to the left. So there are our two shadows, and we can see how they're working in combination with each other. Now in addition to those shadows, I'm also using a gradient overlay, and I guess the point I want to make here is that it's very common to use these effects in combination with each other. Even though the main event here, the star of the show, is the drop shadow, the gradient overlay and the inner shadow are playing important supporting roles. The gradient overlay is not doing a whole lot here, but it's just adding a bit of ambient light. It's darkening, in this case, the bottom left-hand corner of the composition. If I turn that off and then turn it back on again, we can see that that's just making the word shadow a bit darker than the word drop. And these are the values that I want to use. And then I'm also going to add an inner shadow. Just as with the drop shadow, you can determine the angle of the inner shadow by pulling it around within the shape. Once again, I don't want to use global light, so before I do that I'm going to turn that off, and then I can just drag that around. So that was how I arrived at the values that I did, and those values are an angle of 141. I left the blend mode at multiply and the color at black, but an angle of 141, a distance of 13, choke value of 0, and a size of 16 pixels. Now to complete the composition, I did two more things. I added a gradient overlay to the background color fill layer. And I simply did that by copying the gradient overlay that I already have onto that color fill layer. Hold down Option or Alt and drag it onto it. And then I added a layer of texture above the whole thing. And I did that through the Adobe Paper Texture Pro extension. And the one that I used is Colosseum Sienna. So I'll just click on that and it's going to add that layer of texture with a blend mode of overlay, and we can change that if we need to, but it's using a blend mode of overlay, which in this particular case I think works well.